our panelists to you today. We have two esteemed panelists who are joining us, Armida Ferzetti and Aditi Vijay, and they both will be speaking to us about racism and how it is an invalidating environment. Please take it away.
Great, well, thank you. And we are both very excited to be here. Let me just set up some screen share capabilities here and hope that everything goes smoothly. Love technology. So today we're here to talk about how, NEA BPD and the Work and Family Connections does an amazing job in working with families and creating a more validating environment. Given the current situation in the world and the events with George Floyd, as many unfortunately countless other individuals who have been harmed, we decided to kind of take a look at how racism is an extreme invalidating social environment. And so today we're going to talk about how to understand that, and then also end and conclude with some ideas of how we all might be able to contribute to change.
All right, thank you. So we wanted to start by, we just flipped by that picture around Black Lives Matters to really just acknowledge the moment that we're in, and as Armida mentioned, kind of what prompted our presentation, and talk a little bit about, what invalidating responses actually are. You could flip the slide. I think that we've got a pretty heterogeneous audience here today. And so we want to just start by explaining exactly what we mean by invalidating. And it refers to any form of communication. It can be verbal, what you do with your words. It can be an action, but anything that communicates that the valid experiences, desires, emotions, actions, and also the worth of a person are simply not valid and not legitimate. So essentially, we're delegitimizing something that is happening within a particular person in a way that's actually quite harmful. I'm going to start with a benign example, relatively benign, but imagine that you have a young child who's watching Scooby-Doo, and usually before the happy ending, there's a scary moment. If you were to see that child begin to sob and is not able to quite recover from that, eventually we might start to say something to them like, "You're not sad, this isn't scary." And all of those things serve to just invalidate that child's response of being quite scared in that moment. What we're going to also talk about here today is the other ways in which we might do that and how we do that around the issue of race. So second here, the second bullet point is about how we communicate to other people that they actually don't have value or worth, or that their value or worth are less than that of other people, or maybe their voices are minimized. One timely example is if you consider the current New York Times bestseller list, that in the wake of George Floyd's murder, there's been a huge interest in books around anti-racism, which is wonderful. And at this moment, the top selling author just happens to be somebody who's white. Nothing wrong with that. We want people to read, and we want to think about whose voices are amplified. We can also invalidate through our words or our actions the private experiences of somebody else. So indicating that what they're thinking or feeling or experiencing doesn't make sense or is wrong. So an example might be a colleague at work brings up some interaction in a meeting, and perhaps the response of the person that they're seeking feedback from is that, "Well, I didn't really see it that way," or "Nobody else heard it that way. Are you sure that that's what you were thinking about?" These are examples of just minor interactions, or what feels like relatively minor interactions, that end up invalidating somebody else. And at an extreme, perhaps the actual experience of a person is not attended to or is disregarded. And at times it's even pathologized. So sometimes we might think of people being, too emotional or too much, or they're too difficult to deal with. And in the case of race, we might pathologize them. And that's where we get this description perhaps of the angry minority. So we want to think about what is the impact of these chronic and pervasive invalidating responses. So first, chronic in the sense that it's recurring. It's not just one interaction. It's not just one moment. It's not just one time. And pervasive in the sense that it encompasses all aspects of life. So what then is that impact? First, we look at just the increased emotional arousal. If I'm telling you that I feel sad and you tell me, no, I don't, you're probably going to see me react in quite a large way. Or have you ever had the experience of telling someone just calm down? Chances are you're going to see them actually elevate just a little bit more. And so what that leads to are these increased psychological problems. And so to demonstrate this using some data, this is from a study by Schenk and Frusetti, this is Alan Frusetti, where we looked at the impact of validating and invalidating responses on a sample of young adults. And it was a cross-section of folks who were both middle class and lower SES in the Western United States. And in this experiment, the participant was asked to come into the lab and complete a stressful task, which is what you see that first arrow between point 0 and 1. On the y-axis there, we have the negative emotional arousal. So we're just tracking how negatively do they feel. And you can see that between 0 and 1, what happens is that we ask these people to complete a stressful math task. We made it stressful. It was something that we felt was impossible to answer, and certainly impossible in the time frame that they were given, because we wanted to test the impact of the validating and invalidating responses. When they get to that time point 1, we asked them, the experimenter asked them to describe how they were feeling, and then depending on the condition that they were randomized into, they were either validated or invalidated. So what you see there is how quickly that negative emotional arousal spiked. So we're talking about, I believe that first chunk only lasted about 6 minutes. And then they got either 2 minutes of a validating response or 2 minutes of an invalidating response. And then we asked them to go on and do the second math problem. And this same set of events repeated for the next 3 rounds. And what you can see here is the red is the invalidating condition, and you can see that between point 1 and 2, they stayed the same. They came down a little bit, but not very much. And our green line is the validating condition, where they got responses like, the participant might say, this was really difficult. They got a response like, yeah, that makes sense, or these math problems are really hard. I struggle with that too. And you can see how quickly that green line descends. And they get much closer back to where they started or their baseline. Now the red line, where those folks were getting responses like, gosh, like, why is this so hard for you? It's not hard for anybody else. This is where they are. And what I want to point out here is that when we think about the chronic and pervasive invalidation of race, or the experience of being Black in America, being Indigenous in America, or a person of color, this is where it lives. Like, this is where that invalidation takes us. And I want you to keep that in mind as we continue in our discussion. So just to expand on our earlier point about the impact of the chronic and pervasiveness of this invalidation, what actually happens, or what do we see in these groups of people? And just consider, if you think about the graph on the previous slide, if you were living on that red line, how long do you think it would be before you also developed all of these outcomes that I'm about to describe? Really it starts with that emotional arousal, that normal, natural arousal in response to the invalidation doesn't have time to return to baseline. So folks never really get a break. And what happens is that it brings along associated psychological and health-related problems. We have the usual suspects like depression and anxiety, and we have health-related problems. So we see a higher mortality rate for Black women in pregnancy. We see higher rates of cardiovascular disease. And a stat that I saw yesterday in a recently published article was that In a group of Black women between the ages of 35 and 44, they were 9 times more likely to die from COVID than their white counterparts. So these effects are real and problematic as a result of the system that we have within which this invalidation persists. People go on to develop justified anxiety. So if you have this history of invalidation and you are unclear about what to expect in whatever your next interaction is, so going into the grocery store, going into a Starbucks, going to work, it would be quite natural that you develop anxiety about these events, and also that you start to develop anticipatory anxiety. So before anything even happens, or before there's a thought in your head of going to the grocery store, you're already worrying. And so this oftentimes can lead to overlearning this behavior because it's healthy and it's protective for you. It's adaptive in some situations, and it also causes difficulties. It can be overgeneralized so that you are applying this, or you are feeling this anxiety in all the situations that you're going into. And when we think about what we know about anxiety, it means that we're very focused on things that have not yet happened, and it shrinks our focus. It's hard for us to pay attention to the full environment. And this, excuse me, naturally leads into a justified lack of trust. So if you have a history of people not listening and not responding to you, why would you expect something different in the future? And so as people in the healthcare field, as educators, as supervisors, as bosses, we have to really consider what this means for us. So this lack of trust, for example, I just want to share a couple examples about how this isn't limited to one small portion or segment of the Black population. But Serena Williams is a great example of somebody who wrote publicly about her experience when she was giving birth to her daughter, and how she had a difficult time getting her doctor to listen to her when she was rating her pain. This resulted in issues with blood clots. It's written about widely. You can read about it if you're interested, but this is just one small example as to why it would be very difficult to go back and ask for help, and an example of being, profoundly invalidated. I'm in pain and I need help, and someone's not listening. So if we move on to think about this piece, if that person then goes on and has others tell them, like, you must not have communicated that effectively, or if the doctor themselves says, no, I was listening, that's not what you said, it becomes even more difficult once you've been gaslighted in that manner. And here I also want to highlight that sometimes this can actually lead Black, Indigenous, and people of color to self-invalidate their own experiences, which adds to, difficulties for them in progressing in their careers, asking for the help they need, networking. It's pervasive, and it is a problem. And so that's where we get to this last point around problematic coping. That it's all of these things together. It's about how this makes it difficult to simply be in your life. It's about how this constant anxiety and lack of trust, which is helpful on one hand as a self-protective mechanism, can cause problems on the other hand. One statistic here that I think really helps us to kind of see this point is to just consider suicide rates in Black youth that are rising exponentially. A recent study shared data that indicated that in Black girls, that rate has risen by 182% between 2001 and 2017. And so we see how, that's not a coping strategy that we want people to engage in. It can lead to all sorts of other things: withdrawal, isolation, not pursuing opportunities that somebody might want. But it also leads to justified anger. And that's one that I want to make sure that we highlight here, that when you consider just these few points that we've shared with you, and that's before we get into the long history of invalidation within the history of the United States, I think you can see just from these few slides that the anger people of color, Indigenous and Black people feel is actually quite valid. It makes sense within this context. And yet when that justified anger is expressed or presented, it's often invalidated too, in the form of like, why do people protest like that? If the protests were peaceful, then we would listen. And policymakers saying, you know, next election, next election. And so we want to keep these things in mind as we start to think about these different levels of invalidation and what that can look like in different settings.
Thanks, Aditi. So we want to highlight different levels of invalidation. For those of you all who are familiar with the work of Family Connections, we spend a lot of time talking about developing and levels of validation. And so for those of you all who are familiar with that, this may end up seeming like, wait, what? Levels of invalidation? And I think really to understand the systemic level of racism that is present in the United States, understanding these levels of invalidation might be key to that. So the first level is one in which it's focused on one person and their specific behavior. And I want you to keep that in mind, and that right now what I'm talking about is just one person and one person's specific behavior or their experience. So for example, it might be that a child is exhibiting fear of a dog, and the dog is wagging its tail. And the parent, you know, kind of notices that their child is, you know, looking fearful and approaches the dog anyway. And we would talk about that as an invalidation. It's not legitimizing or saying that that child's fear is valid, and the child is having that fear. As an adult, we may say, and the dog is friendly. And that level of invalidation is certainly well-meaning. The parent at that point doesn't want the child to be afraid of the dog, and so is really intended and loving. And we all run into those levels of invalidation throughout our life. And if they're balanced with levels of other people who are validating us, it's not necessarily a problem. It becomes a problem, and it worsens when more and more people in that person's social network become invalidating, or if it's chronic and kind of everywhere. And so one of the things that I want you to notice is that we're not saying that we have to rid the world of invalidation, because that actually won't happen. The question and the thing that we want to pay attention is that we want to recognize that levels of invalidation do have harmful effects, and that we can kind of work at decreasing invalidation at these different levels. In the second level of invalidation, we're still talking about like a person and their specific behavior, and a small number of people in that person's world who is invalidating them. So in terms of the child who's been afraid of the dog, and the child persists in being afraid of dogs, then, you know, the communication might be more active. It might be a parent saying, oh, you're being so ridiculous. The dog isn't going to hurt you. Or might be very judgmental. Stop being so sensitive, that type of thing. And again, these are things where we know that they have harmful effects. And this is the level which in the slide that Aditi showed in terms of the math problems and people showing kind of effects on invalidation, this is that level, right? The person was being judged for expressing their level of discomfort with a situation that was valid in terms of being stressful. The child is really afraid of dogs. They really do have that fear. And so when a parent says something like, oh, stop being so silly, that dog isn't going to hurt you, right? It is discounting that child's experience. This gets worse as more and more people become doing it. If the child in their family starts being known as, oh, they're just sensitive, and the eye rolls come out, and everything. And then maybe the child, you know, in their peer group starts being stigmatized for being the sensitive child. This is where this type of invalidation can happen. So again, at this level, we're talking about kind of one person and their specific behavior that that person's exhibiting. And it gets worse as more and more people become invalidating. In the third level of invalidation, again, we're still talking about one person's experience and their specific behavior. It's just that at this point, it becomes threatening. It may threaten their safety. It may threaten in terms of actual actual harm. Examples might be like child abuse or interpersonal violence or rape, where there is a level at which that person's experience, not only is the experience that the person is having is difficult, but how their community reacts to that experience. So, for example, it may be that we've seen this in the Me Too movement at times when that's where that started, right? Where women were being at times blamed for kind of, well, if they didn't dress that way, then this wouldn't have happened. And that, the rape in and of itself, is a very difficult experience to get to. This is highlighting how the invalidation is when the person is blamed for the very thing that was horrific for them to experience. Now, one of the things that tends to happen with these different levels of invalidation is they build on each other. They are cumulative. And so in level 3, the things that happen in level 3, the level 2 and level 1 are present. It's just that we're going to focus on what's the highest level of invalidation, because that's the level that we want to be able to target to be able to do something with. Now, in terms of racism, now in level 4, what we're talking about is a systemic invalidation. It's where many people in the person's community, in the kind of like the culture, so to speak, questions not just the person's specific behaviors that they engage in, but their essential worth as a human being, their value, their legitimacy for just being, for being born. And that level of invalidation is, of course, incredibly disempowering, and it can involve threats to safety and well-being, such as in the murder of George Floyd. It becomes worse when that is excused in some way, when it is talked about as if it is legitimate in some way, when it is talked about as it's legitimate that, well, they shouldn't be riding around with a broken out headlight if they hadn't been doing that. Those types of things where we talk about that the people in power now, it's not just gaslighting from one individual to another individual, blaming that person, but it's kind of society as a whole is, in essence, blaming the individual for being invalidated. And then that even questions that individual's sense of worth. And it is systemic in the sense that we see that in many people, one of the points on Aditi's slide earlier was about self-invalidation, where now people at this level, when they've had a lifelong sense of initially having some of their behaviors and things about them questioned and invalidated, they start questioning themselves. Oh, maybe I did get that job because of my color of my skin. Now it's self-invalidation, and it is systemic and it is powerful. And of course, in terms of, and this is where some of the movement that we're hoping to create by this talk will target this area, this level of invalidation. Because without targeting this level of invalidation, it's not to discount that if, you know, one person does something to change, it's not discounting that. It's just that we are recognizing that it is going to take more than pledges. It is going to take more than reading. It is going to take much more than that to be able to change this level of invalidation. And so now we'd like to kind of move on to being able to talk about some ways in which we can see some useful ways that we can see to go from an invalidating, a systemic invalidation, to hopefully some systemic validation responses.
So we're going to ask everybody to just pause here for a moment and just consider the definition, right, of mindfulness. So we want you to just take a moment and bring some intentional awareness to this moment without attachment or judgment. And we'd like you to just try to notice what you're thinking or what you're feeling or what's come up for you as you've been watching this presentation. And I'm going to give you a quiet moment to do that. Okay. So I hope that you were able to engage in that. And then in this next quiet moment, I want you to just picture the type of world that you would want to live in. What would be included in there? What would make that the type of world, the type of community that you want to be a part of? So again, just one more silent moment to consider this. Okay. And then I'm going to pose the question to you of what role did racism play in your ideal world or your ideal community? My guess is that if you're here, that wasn't a part of it. And we were probably thinking about things like peace and justice and, you know, a sense of community with one another, probably clean skies, fresh water, that sort of thing. And so I think, or our hope in doing this activity is to sort of demonstrate that the idea of thinking about racism from a broader perspective actually encompasses all of us. It's not simply an issue for certain communities. And that means that that solution necessarily requires work on all of our parts. And, you know, we want to think about, like, how do you actually go about moving from thinking to doing? And so a piece of this is thinking about using mindfulness to figure out, like, where are you? What comes up for you when you think about race? How do your past life experiences influence that? And what are you noticing? How do you apply mindfulness to the world around you and to the environment within which you exist? You don't have to be in a big city at a protest, or, you know, you don't have to be, you can fill in the blank with whatever might pop up for you. That there are a lot of different ways to target this, and all of these different ways are extremely important. And in thinking about this, we want to transition to this idea of relationship mindfulness and paying attention to what kind of space do we want to be in? What kind of space do we want to create for ourselves and our family and our children? And when issues arise, when situations unfold in front of you, how do you actually take that relationship mindfulness and apply it to that interaction so that you can be a more effective ally or part of the solution as opposed to part of the problem or potentially invalidating someone? And I think that a big key to this is bringing curiosity to it and really trying to understand. So not necessarily asking someone to educate you, but really trying to understand that experience of that person, which is what, we would essentially say validation is. And part of our hope in giving this talk is to really highlight the point that we don't want the curiosity to stop when the news cycle ends, when the protest ends, or when, we don't want the curiosity to even be diminished until the next horrific death, which sadly we probably don't have to wait too long for. The idea is, how do we incorporate this into our lives in a more methodical, systematic, regular kind of way, to actually change and transform the environment that we're in. And that our hope is that this will potentially lead to making it a little bit easier to provide a validating response.
And I would jump in to say that curiosity, I think there have been many people who have indicated that they really don't understand why are certain people reacting the way they are? Why are people saying certain things? And I think at the heart of that, we can try to help promote curiosity in the sense of under what situations, under what circumstances might you behave in the way that you're seeing somebody who's really angry behave? Because maybe that anger is not understandable to you. And given your life, maybe it doesn't make sense. When we're talking about being curious, it really is being curious to step into that other person's sense of being. What would it be like? What would it take? How can you understand? And of course, that will require mindfulness, because we have to manage our own emotions about things, right? So if I am trying to understand Aditi's experience with something, because even though we are both women of color, her experience is different from mine. And I can't assume that my experience speaks for her. And so if I'm trying to truly understand her experience, and I'm kind of frustrated because she's explaining something to me and it doesn't make any sense to me, my level of frustration may come out towards her, right? It might be like, oh, Aditi, please, come on, right? That is not gonna help, right? I have to step back and understand my frustration is my frustration. She is not to blame for me not understanding. How can I get myself to be even more curious so I can understand even more? How can I express my frustration with, oh, Aditi, I am trying to understand. I am so frustrated with myself right now because I can't understand. And I really want to, right? That's going to be a much different interaction than if I go, oh, Aditi, come on, get over it. Like, enough, right? That is not going to help our relationship. It is not going to help my understanding. And guess what? I've just invalidated her. Right? And so that bringing that curiosity and level of understanding is going to be key if we want to move on to the next level. So in terms of the validating responses, right, sometimes people, you know, you don't know what to say. And so, you know, things like communicating your understanding is validation. So if somebody's being able to explain their experience to you and you understand it and it makes sense to you, you know, you letting them know like, oh, okay, that makes sense, right? Or, okay, I understand. Or, huh, I don't, you know, I get what you're saying on the on this point, but I'm not clear on this other point. Can you tell me more about that? Right? Asking even more curious questions is a validating response. And really what makes it validating is because you're keeping the focus on the individual that you're trying to understand. You're not turning the focus onto you and your experience. You're keeping the focus on them and their experience. Okay, Mike.
So we are borrowing from Marshall Linehan's work here and these other perspectives on mindfulness and wise mind. And so for the folks here who are not familiar with this, we're thinking about this in terms of different states of mind and pulling on the wisdom. I'm going to start by explaining the being mind, where we are kind of trying to sit with whatever is happening around us. And we're adapting this slightly. If you're familiar with the DBT literature, it's not going to map on exactly to what Marcia has said. But this idea of the being mind and like really sitting with the emotions, the thoughts, the feelings that are coming up for you when you think about racism in the United States, wherever you are in your journey or awareness. And in being mind, I think we're including things like accessing resources, reading new books, new articles, new authors, exposing yourself to different traditions and cultures, but with that openness, with that curiosity, and really thinking about what do you want to do. So we want to think about this being and this awareness as this space where you are deepening your own learning and foundational knowledge around structural racism in the US, the idea of being anti-racist, the concepts of being anti-Black and white supremacy, and how those are the things that, you know, it's in the environment in which we exist, it's in the air we breathe, the water we drink, it's really a part of where we currently are, and how do these things actually work before even thinking about how do they actually impact your own life. On the other side, we have this idea of doing mind. So in this state of mind, we're thinking about being productive, being busy, and taking action. And what we want to try to do is get in touch with the overlap of these two things. And so this is our being and doing mind, wise mind. So balancing the being and the awareness with the doing and the action. So what have you learned and what do you see as a current challenge or problem in your own community, at a national level, wherever that might be? You know, what do you see and how do you want to act? And really getting in touch, I think, with those two things to figure out what your next steps are. When Alan Armida and I started talking about this a couple of weeks ago, you know, as we were talking about watching the video of George Floyd and watching these protests and really thinking about what could we actually do as opposed to sitting at home and feeling really angry. And I think this talk was born out of that. And, you know, we will be working also to try to think about what will our next step be and what are we going to be doing next week and how do we incorporate this work as a part of our lives, both personally and professionally. And we're asking all of you who are here to do the same.
So one of the things that we kind of a sort of a call to action would be after this talk to maybe take a look at, you know, what are those things that you're currently doing that would fit into the being mind, or the doing mind? And then how are you going to carry it forward to continue to work on the wise mind doing? And what would it take? And what are those things that you can look around your world and think about how can you incorporate it into your professional life, into your personal life, so that this talk isn't only talk, but results in more people doing.
We wanted to share this quote with you from Thich Nhat Hanh, that we're here to awaken from the illusion of our separateness. I think that, thank you to Armida for finding this, and I think that this sort of captures where we are in this movement. I hope this is, a movement that's going to continue. And I think with that, we're going to close here. I don't know, Armida, if you've got any last comments, or we'll open it up to questions.
Thank you so much to both of you. This was a fantastic presentation. If you do have questions, you can ask them in the Q&A feature or the chat feature, and we will read them out to our presenters and get their thoughts and answers. I just wanted to make one statement and comment before we open up to the questions and answers. Our organization is always interested in increasing our diversity, and we are working hard to reach underserved populations with our programs and services. Please feel free to reach out to us. I'll put my email address in the chat. If you have any ideas, if you want to get involved more with our diversity initiatives, or any questions or concerns. We do have a leader training where we are training people for our Family Connections program in July, and we are really interested in getting different people from different populations to attend the leader training. So if anyone is interested who is either a therapist or has taken the Family Connections program, please feel free, again, to email me and reach out, and we'll get you the right information. I also want to introduce two people who work with me who I believe are here, who are going to be also available to help and answer questions. We have Tina Moore, who's our Family Connections manager here, and I believe Alan Frazzetti was also on earlier. I don't know if he's still on. Oh, here he is. Alan is one of the co-creators of Family Connections. And your questions that will come in, we'll pose them to Armida and Aditi, and if Alan wants to chime in with any of the answers, also we always enjoy hearing from him. So Tina, do we have any questions to start with?
Sorry, we do. What recommendations do you have for those who are being met with the invalidating responses, like you shouldn't be angry?
First, start by taking a deep breath. Always helpful, always helpful. I think that speaks to the levels of invalidation, right? It speaks to how, and I'm assuming about this is that, something's happened and the person's upset that it happened to them, a racist comment, something, and the response when disclosing the situation is, oh, you shouldn't be angry about that. And so first of all is, I think in part is, it really is helpful to manage our own kind of self and seek out validation. Part of this depends on context, right? If this is a spouse who's replying in that way, your response and the amount of work and effort that you're going to put into kind of helping that person and in terms of their understanding is going to be quite different from if it's a person that you don't interact with very often. And so there is a lot of self-care that I think that we all have to do within ourselves regarding invalidation, and recognizing that there are times where I was talking to Aditi about this yesterday, where I noticed that there are times where things happen in my life and I don't even disclose them, not because I don't have family and friends who would be very supportive. I'm very fortunate and do. It's more that I tend to want to get away from it as quickly as possible, and not recognizing that's actually probably self-invalidating. So one key, I think, would be to ensure that at minimum, that you're not then engaging in kind of self-invalidation. So finding ways that you can validate yourself in those instances, and seeking out other people who are going to be validating. And again, context does matter in these situations. And I don't know if, Aditi, you have anything to add to that.
I think that the only thing I would add to that, I agree with all that was said, and that sometimes it can be helpful, of course, context dependent, finding kind of a safe space. Like, is there somebody that you can talk to who you know is going to give you real feedback? Because we're not saying that every time somebody says you shouldn't be angry, that's incorrect. But what we're saying is that it largely depends on many other things that are happening. And so having that space where you know that you're going to be met with validation and support, I think is hugely important. So it might not be somebody who's close to you geographically, it might not be somebody who's in your work environment, but doing what you can to seek that out. And I want to acknowledge that can be a very painful process.
So we have a question here. We do have a lot of clinicians who are on this call. We have a question. What should a clinician do when a client endorses racist attitudes or beliefs, perhaps directed towards them, and invalidating, or just society in general? So what should a clinician do?
So I think that this is a tough one, and I think this is something that happens perhaps more often than people realize, of course, depending on who you are in the room. I think that you're balancing a lot of things. First, the therapeutic relationship. Second, like your self-respect and feelings within that space, and thinking about like where this client actually is. So if a client was to say something to me that is invalidating, I would say potentially, but it happens quite often. I think that the first thing to do is to really consider, like, what do I know about this person's context? How does that relate to their problematic behavior, what they're coming in for help with? Do they have the capacity to actually engage in a conversation about this? Because it does have the capacity to be a rupture in the relationship therapeutically. And if the person does not have the skills to engage in that conversation, what is the thing for me to do? And I think from there, we consult with our teams and we make some decisions about that. And I don't think that necessarily there's anything that says you have to deal with it in that moment, in that interaction with that person right then. Therapists are people too, so we also can get dysregulated, or our arousal can go up, and we might want to actually use a stop skill to just pause for a minute, think about it, perhaps move back, and then talk to our team, get some consultation, and then re-engage. Of course, sometimes these invalidations are so egregious, maybe you have to say something in the moment, and that does outweigh like that therapeutic moment. But our therapeutic relationships are constructive of multiple moments. So, that's when we really lean into this idea that we can always go back and repair. And I don't know what thoughts other folks have about that.
No, I would just echo what you said, and recognize that in that moment as a treatment provider, it would require us to be mindful of that relationship. And how are we going to respond to that in an effective way? And linking that back to kind of what are the patient's goals, what are the context in which this is happening. And I would echo what Aditi said. I think a lot of times we feel like we have to respond in that moment. And if something like that happens in the room, for the long term of our relationship with the patient, it probably does make sense for us to kind of step back and kind of figure out with a team, or if you're not on a team, consult with a colleague on kind of how you want to respond, rather than only responding in that moment.
So I have a two-part question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the first one is there do you have any practical ideas for things that people can do beyond protests? And then the other question is, how do you deal with someone who has a belief that you may not share, and it's not easily validated? So someone, if that makes sense. So someone may be sharing their idea with you, and you're like, I don't share that same idea. I can't validate that. What would you do in that situation?
Right. Well, so there's two pieces, right?
Yes.
The first is kind of practical kind of things of what people can do. And I think in part, there are protests, there is voting, there are other activism kind of things. And I think in terms of when we think about societal change, it is a very powerful thing to take a look around your local community and, take a moment and look around and be open to the question of, are there things within my community that are happening that really are reinforcing this level 4 invalidation? And then being open to that, and then thinking like, what could we do? This may be your workplace. It may be your town. It may be the schools that your child attends. Working at those levels and being open and recognizing that this is systemic. It is all over the place. And so being willing, and I think this is hard because this requires all of us to be a bit vulnerable and acknowledge that, these things are happening in my town. I love my town, and they're happening here. And so for me to be willing to kind of like say, okay, my town that I love and have pride in many ways has these things going on. If I acknowledge that, how can I make some changes within my town, right? So I think those are there's a lot of active things that people can do. So in terms of I'm not sure if anybody else has anything they want to add to that piece. No? Okay.
So we are getting,
and then yeah, go ahead.
You go.
So, and then for the second piece, validation, remember, is not about agreeing with. It's not about condoning. It's about recognizing what is the kernel of truth, so to speak, in that position, right? How does it make sense that that person has that position, right? Oftentimes we get polarized with people who don't agree with us because we don't acknowledge what is the legitimacy in that. And if we want to have some discussions, for example, if I have a family member who is supporting a political view that I really do not agree with, then for me to be able to acknowledge, okay, what's the legitimacy? Why would my family member hold that belief? How does that make sense, right? And if I don't understand why that makes sense, asking curious questions of why that makes sense. That in and of itself, asking a curious question, is a validating response. So I think sometimes when we use that word validation, it's not about agreement. So when we validate someone, we don't have to agree with them. We have to acknowledge how does it make sense that the person has that view? And actually, I think when we do that, they're more likely to listen to our point of view as well. And I think that can then create more discussion rather than kind of polarization where people just, you know, kind of get angry and stop listening to one another.
So we're getting a couple of questions here regarding what do you do when you work in a place that has an invalidating culture, or you know, how to stop anti-racism in graduate school programs for psychology. So more on the institutional level.
I can take a stab at that one. I think first of all, like, this is a really exciting moment to be there. I mean, I think there's a lot that goes in the other direction around that, but like, this is a moment when the world is listening. I saw somebody from the NBA last night say, it's not the time to play basketball. People are listening. We don't want anything else to start, no entertainment. So I think we have to capitalize on this moment. I think that this work is really difficult. I think that you've got to be prepared to be met with invalidation at all levels from people who are nice or your friends, or, you know, and I think that there are tons of resources available at the moment that have not been there before. There are anti-racist syllabi being published and shared on social media. And I think that that actually is potentially a place to start. If I take a step back and think about, you know, more pragmatically, I think it's about raising awareness, and then it's about moving to what action steps can you take in your institution. But I think that there's much broader agreement than I've ever seen in my lifetime around Black Lives Mattering. People being willing to say it. It's less political than when we were saying it after Trayvon Martin. And I think that it really does start like with thinking about increasing awareness, increasing knowledge, like really increasing facts, thinking about the history of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the US, finding a way to incorporate that into your syllabi, and then starting to create work groups and focus groups about talking about what's happening in your institution. And I think really pulling in as many diverse allies as you can. And that is where I think we start to see some change happening. I think if you're a graduate student and you feel like you don't have a lot of power, that maybe it's about creating a journal club, you know, with your cohort. I was a graduate student and Alan was my mentor, and we used to do something on Friday afternoons called Beer and Behaviorism, kind of made it fun. And we would have one article to read. I don't remember if it was really on a weekly basis. That was certainly the goal. But even thinking about ways like that, can you make it something where there's an interesting conversation to pull in people that you think might not be interested? I think, though, that the basic frame is the increasing awareness, increasing knowledge. Those go together. Kind of think of those as a tango, and then translating that into action. A second point to that is I wouldn't shy away from changes that seem minor. It doesn't have to be about changing the admissions policy overnight, but really talking to the people within your institution about what is problematic and how can those things change. You know, so something that if you're a part of the majority culture doesn't seem like a big deal to you, to somebody who's a person of color, it really could be. So that means that you have to like broaden your sphere. You have to be open, able to manage emotions and engage in these more realistic, kind of gritty conversations to get a sense of what's really happening for marginalized folks. And then I think that that translates into action.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I think that in the mental health field, I think we really do need to take a strong look at this. We know that in terms of representation of individuals who are distressed and actually seek and obtain services, the Black, Indigenous, people of color are sorely underrepresented in terms of that. And we have to take a look at what are we doing in our system that creates that? And what can we do differently? And my guess is that there will be some professional who say, no, 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 we're open. They just don't come. They just don't want to come. No, we need to take a look at our own system and fix it and acknowledge that there are things that we are doing that are creating this situation. And it's up to us to fix it.
So a huge thank you to both of you, Aditi and Armida, for this fantastic presentation. This is a conversation that we need to continue and continue to have on an ongoing basis. So we look forward to continuing the dialogue. And I want to thank you for all of your wonderful words of wisdom. For those people who have commented on questions and in the chat, we will review them. And if we do have a response or an answer, we will get back to you if the question was not posed anonymously. And we thank you so much for your time today. As we've mentioned, this recording will be available on our website, which is www.neabpd.org. The recording will be available within 48 hours. Thank you so much and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.